IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to this episode of All Things Policy. As many of our listeners might know, we've recently published a book, which is an edited volume based on one of our flagship projects, Understanding the New World Order. The book is called India's Marathon, Reshaping the Post-Pandemic World Order, and it aims to understand how the world order is changing and what India must do about it. We've brought together original chapters by a host of leading public intellectuals, experts, and practitioners to create a comprehensive vision of the future centered on India and for India watchers across the world. You'll find a link to the ebook in the episode description. Our goal is to have a series of podcasts with some of these authors, and today we are talking to the brilliant Shruti Rajagopalan, who's a senior research fellow at the McCarthy Center at George Mason University and a fellow at the Classical Liberal Institute at NYU School of Law, and as I found out, a podcasting veteran. She's appeared on many podcasts, especially The Seen and the Unseen, which is also supported by the Takshashila Institution. Welcome, Shruti.
Hi, Anupam. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, we're very excited to have you on board. And this is something actually we should have done long back, is to have a podcast with you. But this particular book and your chapter in it, I think, provides the perfect kind of launch pad for, I hope to be a series of, podcasts with you. So you've written a chapter in this particular book as to, about India's population. And you've taken quite a, I would say a different stance. We've been, I think, trained almost from the beginning to look at India's population as a curse, right? And also as, the root of many of India's problems. You find, most dinner table conversations around any problem in India. And people are very quick to pin the blame on India's population. So, and just even the casual wording, as you've noted in the chapter, is that we always refer to India's population as overpopulation, right? But you don't think so. You think that India's population can actually be an asset, right?
So exactly, Anupam. So the thing is, the idea that human beings, by virtue of existing, in some way burden the world, to me, I think just morally it feels like a very distasteful idea, right? Because it makes it seem like it's okay for me to exist and pass judgment, but no new people should be on this planet, right? And I think there are two problems with it. I think it's just, one, just plain simple wrong. And the second, it leaves a very bad taste in my mouth to think about other humans in that particular way. And I'll tell you why I think it's just simply wrong. Humans may be an additional mouth to feed, but they are also an additional mind that can be put to work. Right? And they're also an additional pair of hands that can work in the labor market. They're also an additional set of eyeballs who can contribute, to the network effect that we talk about later in the paper. So to think about human beings just as someone who consumes resources like almost like a parasite, I think is just a terrible idea. Now, why do Indians actually espouse this view? And I've thought about this for a long time, and I think it has to do with two things. One, we are all in some sense hardwired, in evolutionary terms, to think within the tribe, right? And in some sense, the cultural evolution and the economic evolution have been much faster than the biological evolution. So we have still not evolved as fast as technology and culture and the economy have evolved around us. So some of the remnants of this old, and when I say old, I mean tens of thousands of years worth of evolution old, some of these mindsets are hardwired into us to think in terms of zero sum, or to think in terms of within the tribe, to think in terms of scarcity, because, we were hardwired from a hunter-gatherer sort of environment and so on and so forth. The second part, I believe, is because of the kind of artificial scarcity and shortages we have created in the Indian economy. Right? Now, when I go to a supermarket in the United States in, like the 21st century, there are no shortages, right? I don't feel upset about people being in the store at the same time as me because there are no lines there. I don't feel like someone is getting to something faster than me. In fact, lots of people at the supermarket is a good thing for me because if there are lots of South Asians, Trader Joe's has just, launched a South Indian mixture, like the chura, right? Because there are enough people who like South Asian food who go to Trader Joe's, right?
Right.
And so I feel happy that there are lots and lots of people who go to the same supermarket as I go to, because then all the things that I really like are also going to be available. I can get really good Ethiopian food at the local Whole Foods. I can get really good like masala aloo patties at the local Trader Joe's. I mean, this is all within 5-10 minutes walk of where I live. Right? Now, imagine a world where that is not the case and you have, your classic socialist shortages, right? So this is my grandmother standing in queue or making me and my sister stand in a long queue at the ration shop to make sure we can get our sugar rations, right? This is not that long ago. This is in my lifetime. I'm talking late 80s, early 90s, which means when you're standing in the long queue and you're really frustrated and you can't get all the things you want and you're wasting your time, the person you're going to blame most obviously are the 10 people standing in the queue in front of you, right? So when we create these artificial shortages because of bad economic policy, immediately you turn citizen against citizen instead of thinking of other people around you as part of a larger extended order or as a part of larger social cooperation. You actually think of them as a problem because they are going to get ahead of you in line, or they are going to get to the water before you, and water is only available 2 or 3 hours a day, right? They're going to take up all the electricity usage because there's only so much to go around. So a lot of what happens in India with this kind of, this whole chatter about overpopulation, it comes from 2 places. The public goods infrastructure in India has just not kept up, and we had massive artificial scarcities and shortages imposed upon us because of socialism. Now, thankfully, the shortages have gone away post-liberalization to a large extent. We still have some, but to a large extent, they have gone away. But the public goods infrastructure is just crippling. It has kept up nowhere close to the population increase and urbanization. So it's very natural for people when they're in a frustrated moment to blame each other, but they're actually blaming the wrong thing. The problem is that the size of the pie was never allowed to grow large enough. The moment the size of the pie is allowed to grow large enough, you actually want other people around you. Because if there are lots of people in one place, then you can get a great ethnic food restaurant or a, Chinese restaurant, or, you can get banana chips from, Alape in Kerala, or you can get sushi, in the big metropolitan cities in Delhi and Mumbai, which is something that never used to happen when I was growing up in India. So there are advantages to lots of people around you. If you notice, every single person in India is picking a denser environment to a sparser environment. Look at the migration pattern in India. Everybody wants to move to cities. They are worse. They're more congested. They're more polluted. They're harder. There's more hardship in life, but everyone still wants to go to the city because the gains from being in a place where there are so many people and the market order is so large is very, very large, right? So that's what people choose. But the reason people complain is what is seen. What is seen is someone taking your stuff before, you can get to it.
Yeah, I think that's an extremely interesting perspective, and that essentially looking at population as an overburden, or as a burden rather, or looking at, this entire thing as a zero-sum game is a factor of the circumstances in which people find themselves in. So what you're saying is, while it might have made sense to look at this in the 60s and 70s because of our particular circumstances that I think we put ourselves in, with all of the socialism, it doesn't make sense in 2020, right? At this point of time when we are growing, in perhaps not entirely now, but in the last 20 years or so, we've been growing at a reasonable pace, and there's a lot more of goods and services and, of course, income going around, that you don't really have to look at each other as a rival for what you aspire for.
Absolutely. And even now, even in present day pandemic times when people think too many people and density is a bad thing, let's not forget that the best ideas and the best minds who are producing vaccines, they're not doing it on Mars. They're not doing it in rural areas, and they're not doing it in Antarctica. right? They're doing it in big cities, in big universities, in big labs, collaborating with the extended global order, right?
Yeah.
More people, more smart people working on the vaccine means we will solve this problem sooner. So even in a pandemic world, what I'm saying is not necessarily, suddenly negated.
Yeah, that's true. That's absolutely true. But we'll come to that aspect later. I just want to, bounce off this other idea, which is that, you've spoken about all of this from a citizen's perspective as to why one citizen should not really look at another as a rival in terms of goods and services and so on. But there's another interesting kind of perspective, which is coming from the politician's angle. Now, in India, by and large, you've also had politicians who look at the population as a problem. And I mean, apart from, of course, getting votes, but, when it comes to actually governing, they look at it as a problem. Would you say that is largely because more often than not, politicians tend to assume the role of what markets are supposed to do? That is, they try to allocate scarce resources. They're terrible at doing that, and therefore consider that as a problem, especially when resources are scarce, and of course you have a large population that you try and divide this. This was, I think, the classic problem until again we let the markets determine some of these things. So until 91, at least, this was very hardwired. But even now, you still have ration shops, you still have a lot of things which the government wants to do, and therefore would look at allocation, which it's not supposed to be doing, as one of the fundamental problems.
Absolutely. This is, you've really got it on the nose, right? So there are two parts. One is allocation and distribution, right? So the reason the Indian government and the erstwhile socialists entered the problem of allocation was because they thought market allocation did not distribute fairly, right? Whatever was their standard of fairness, and that they could do better than the market system. Right? So that's the, classic reason for socialist price controls and quantity controls and so on and so forth. Now there are two things going on. One, of course, we know from, now we know from everything from Adam Smith to F.A. Hayek that this kind of, tinkering with the price system simply doesn't work. It has too many unintended consequences. And you are thinking about the economy as a static model, that if you reduce the price, then, people would get it, at a lower price. But on the other hand, if you actually control the price, greater supply is not forthcoming. Right? There's also a supply curve, which is upward sloping. So as soon as you allow prices to adjust, more people also supply the good that is suddenly in shortage in the market, right? And that is the aspect that, typically, and it's not just politicians, I think everyone just forgets that little aspect, right? When we take Ubers or we take Olas in India, right? We are against surge pricing, because no one wants to pay lots and lots of money. But the truth of the matter is surge prices never last that long. And by long, I mean, they don't even last a couple of hours, right? The moment there is surge, there are enough new drivers who log on and say, you know what, I can make a killing. The supply is forthcoming, and suddenly the surge starts dropping back.
That's by design, right? I mean, the surge is
exactly.
It's meant to be temporary. You can't
it
have
is
a
meant to be
permanent
temporary. Surge. Exactly, because the market will adjust, right? The longest surge I have seen is usually when there is a hurricane or there is New Year's Eve or something like that, when there are too many people who don't want to drink and drive, something that really constrains the increase in supply or suddenly, shoots up the demand. But other than that, surges are typically temporary. So this is an insight that hasn't really penetrated the policymakers or the ordinary people. I mean, this is something that's fundamentally unintuitive, right? You and I know this because we study and we teach economics for a living. And so it has become second nature to us. But I think politicians are people too. And usually what they see is, I have, N number of rupees to allocate, X number of goods among these people. And there are too few rupees and too few goods to go around. And I don't trust the market. Right? That's the typical attitude. And like you said, that's where a lot of the shortages come from. I think there is a second reason for it, which is a public choice reason. It is much easier to blame people moving to cities for congestion problems than take the responsibility and say we didn't provide the infrastructure.
Yeah.
If the government actually provides the infrastructure and the public goods it's supposed to provide, if it actually clears the garbage, if it actually builds stormwater drains to make sure water doesn't get logged, right? If it actually builds sewage systems, then you're not going to have piles of garbage, open defecation, water logging, disease, all the classic public health, pollution, congestion problems, right? That's when you're like, oh, this is because of all these migrants who showed up and they sleep on the footpath and they shit on the street, the typical middle class attitude towards this. But it really comes from the politician also letting themselves off the hook, because it is very easy to perpetuate this tribalist zero-sum thinking. And then, your voters are going to let you off the hook for not keeping up the infrastructure at the level it's supposed to be at.
Yeah, but Shruti, you're, I think, speaking of nuance, which a lot of people do not want. It's far easier to blame someone else than look at all of this nuance, right? So,
absolutely.
But now moving on, especially, again, coming back to this entire population, and I want to get again into the nuance, right? So you, in your chapter, speak of 3 ways in which the population of India can actually be an advantage. And I want to take this up one by one. In the first instance, you talk about, how the size of the market leads to division of labor and specialization. And as we know, again, in economics, we know that, division of labor and specialization is the bedrock of economic progress. So can you speak a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. So, this is literally the first thing that you read in the very first modern economics text that was written in the world. I'm talking, of course, about Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, right? Adam Smith is actually the title of the book is an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. And this is important because Adam Smith is trying to understand why some countries are rich or regions are rich and why other countries or regions are poor. And the first thing he talks about is not GDP numbers and trade numbers and macro and nothing like that. The book actually begins, the setting is a pin factory, right? They're just making pins, right? And he talks about what kind of industry, goes on in a pin factory and how many people work there and what's going on. And he finds something extraordinary. He says there are about 18 different tasks involved in making a pin, right? You need to get the metal, you need to clean it, you need to flatten it, you need to pull it out into wires, someone needs to cut the wire, someone needs to sharpen one end, someone needs to blunt the other end, and, then put them all together and pack it and so on and so forth. So he identifies these 18 different tasks. And he says, if one individual were to do all 18 tasks, right? You could maybe produce one pin. And if you're really amazing at it, in a day, you could maybe produce 20.
Yeah.
Right? That's the simple argument. Right? And then he says, at this particular pin factory, right, they made 48,000 pins per day.
Right.
Right? 48,000 pins per day between 10 people. Right?
Okay.
Which means when you divide your labor and cooperate with people, the division of labor and specialization, then you get a 240x increase in productivity. This is not a small increase. You went from making one pin, if you were an ordinary person, 20 pins, if you were an extraordinary pin maker by yourself, to making, 1/10 of 48,000 pins.
Yeah.
Right? That is an extraordinary increase in productivity. And the only reason it happens is because of division of labor and specialization, right? Because if I had to do all these 18 tasks, my attention is scattered and I don't get better at doing it. But if all day, all I did was cut wire, I can cut 48,000 pieces of wire that day. That's the insight, right? Yeah. So it's something really quite extraordinary what Adam Smith observed, something we all see and just notice and ignore. This is something Adam Smith actually thought about. And he said, this is the cause of the wealth of nations, right? This division of labor and specialization. Now let's talk about this a little bit more. Now, the reason we want large numbers is not just because we need 10 people to make the pins in the factory as opposed to one person. That's not the insight. The reason is these 10 people, to actually engage in the task of making pins and devoting their entire day and life to making pins, they'll only do so if they are confident that they can sell the pins in exchange for the things they really want, right? Yeah. Because you can't eat pins, you can't wear pins. You need to exchange that. So only in an environment where you can actually specialize in one particular area, right? So much that you can trade that labor for everything else that you need in your life, will you see this kind of specialization. That's the insight. So you are never going to see, a pin factory in a feudal system. Right. Yeah. It's a different kind of economy. You are likely not going to see a pin factory in a rural area, right? Because the size of the market is once again not large enough. But in an urban area, not only will you see a pin factory, you might even see further specialization within the pin factory, different shops doing different things. You might see a shop that is just dedicated to cutting wire and nothing else but cutting wire, and so on and so forth. So this kind of division of labor lends itself well only when the size of the market is large enough. Right. And that is really the true insight of Adam Smith, right? The division of labor and specialization is limited by the extent of the market order, right? That's the insight. Now, what is the market order? The market order is people, trading with one another. Another thing that, Smith said about human beings, which is they have the propensity to truck, barter, and exchange one thing for another. And the division of labor is an emergent property of this institution of market exchange that we do with each other, right? Now, you teach economics and policy for a living, right? I teach economics and policy for a living. Our jobs would not exist if we did not work in a system of deep division of labor. Absolutely. Because as much as I love economics and you love economics, once again, you can't wear it, eat it, pay with it for Netflix and so on and so forth. Right? Yeah. You have to get paid. The market has to be large enough that they value this as a service that people will pay us, and then we can get everything else we need. Now, if we truly loved economics, but we didn't live in an extended order, what you and I would likely do is we would have day jobs. We'd probably work in the farm all day. And then maybe in the evening for a couple of hours, we'd get some people together and talk economics. But it is... Yeah, so it's the extended order that allows people like you and me to have this job, right? So we all want to be in an extended order. That's where all the gains are. Now, this extended order comes about. Obviously, you need two things. You need lots of people, and you need those people to be very prosperous. It's not just lots of poor people, because it's the market, right? So the market is constrained both by headcount, but it's also constrained by purchasing power. So very rich places in very rich countries, even a small village where there aren't too many people living there, you will see, really nice supermarkets which actually stock all the things that are required, right? Because people are rich enough that they can patronize these stores. But typically, you see in poor environments, in developing countries, you will see massive division of labor only in really urban environments, right? Very, very dense cities. That is where the action is.
That's true. So this is, again, very interesting. Now, if we apply this principle to India, one is, of course, the rural-urban divide, and we can assume that you won't find that much of division of labor and specialization in the rural economy, but you might find that in urban. But if you take India as a whole, one thing that I think comes out is that the numbers are huge, but the second principle that you allude to, which is to do with the purchasing power of the, of the numbers. So the per capita income is still extremely low. So I remember reading a piece in the Economist, I think you'd also remember that about India's middle class, right? The famed Indian middle class. And you'd actually find that the actual middle class who can purchase, who has enough disposable income for it to matter as a market, is actually not that much, right? So where would you place India? Does it have the numbers, or do we still have to, grow a lot more before India's market can actually be one of those a thing of allure for companies to come and set up here? If you look at, even today's scenario where we're looking at companies going out of China and looking at installing themselves in other countries, and we naturally assume that India would be one of those destinations because we're a large market. But not a lot of them have come. I mean, it could be because of a whole set of reasons, of course. But one thing to look at is perhaps that India's market is not as big as we imagine. The numbers are huge, but purchasing power, not so much. Would that be a fair way to characterize it?
Absolutely. But the beautiful thing about markets is they are never binaries, right? So India already has a really large and functional market. The question is, can it be larger? Can it be more unified? Can it be more vibrant? Can it have deeper division of labor? And the answer is absolutely yes. So I'll give you two examples, right? Now, if we notice in India, two things happen simultaneously. We had telecom deregulation. Right. We also liberalized and, reduced tariffs on all sorts of, imports at the same time. And simultaneously there was an internet revolution that was happening throughout the world. Like these three things sort of happened around the same time. Now, as a consequence of that, India has excellent telecom infrastructure, and it has big players who have come into, the 5G and the data plus mobile services and so on. Now, because that service has been provided relatively cheaply, and we can talk a little bit later about why, it has these network good properties, and we'll get to that. But because that service has been provided so cheaply, even people who are not that rich make it a point to be able to buy some kind of a cell phone or a smartphone. Right? They may not have the same cell phone and smartphone you and I have. They may not be patrons of Apple or Samsung, right? They might end up buying a cheaper phone, but that cheap phone does 99% of what my Apple phone does. Maybe some of the things it does even better, frankly, right? So the reason is that they are able to now see the gains and patronize a particular kind of product, which in this case is smartphones, right? So in India, we are already at a level of development where people want to buy smartphones, and cheap Chinese smartphones, cheap Indian-made smartphones, cheap, Korean and Taiwanese-made smartphones have a huge market in India, right? That's what's going on. So does India have a large market? Well, the question is for what? And I would say for smartphones and cell phones, absolutely. Now, I'll give you another example, which is the Harley-Davidson motorcycle. Right. And the reason I'm coming up with this example is because, President Trump, many months ago in his first trip, just before he came to India in January, February sometime, he said one of the things on his agenda is to make sure that Prime Minister Modi reduces tariffs even further. Can you believe it used to be 100% tariff on Harley Davidsons, which has now come down to 50%, which is still too high. Right? Yeah. Now, of course, we want tariffs to be low. But let's say we reduced Harley-Davidson tariffs to zero. Yeah. Are we going to be selling a lot of Harley-Davidsons in India? The answer is no. Right? And frankly, most people don't pay the tariff on Harleys because Harley has a setup in Delhi where they assemble it, right? Because, they'll get the parts and they'll assemble it. They'll escape the 100% tariff that used to be imposed. But even then, they're selling like a few thousand Harley-Davidson motorcycles at best, right? I think the number is 3,000. I could be wrong. Okay. Now, technically, India has 1.3 billion people. Why can't we sell more Harley-Davidson motorcycles? Because frankly, at that price point, there aren't too many people who can buy it. Right? It's also not the best bike to have in congested cities where people are going to keep knocking it and you can't park it. And it's this shiny thing that 4 cars are going to hit on a daily basis and so on and so forth. Right? So it's not exactly conducive for anything except, a very rich patron who's probably going to go on bike rides to the mountains or something like that. Right? Yeah. So that's why that market is so small. Now, can that market get large? Absolutely. Right? Yeah. We have better roads, we have better urban services. Most importantly, we have richer population. The market for Harleys will be double, triple. The sky is the limit. I would like to drive a Harley one day. Who knows, right? So the market is there. The potential is there. But this is what I mean by it's not a thing. It's not a static thing. For some things, we already have deep markets and penetration. For other things like Harley Davidson, for frozen foods, you just don't. Right? Yeah, I get excellent Indian frozen food in the United States, which my mother can't get in Delhi, because that market and that infrastructure has not developed.
Yeah. And of course, your favorite banana chips as well.
Oh my God, I'm obsessed with banana chips. We can talk about that later, but I'll follow your lead.
Yeah. So one is the disposable income. And I think that was an excellent answer that, there are markets for some and not as much as for the others. The second one, of course, with India is the segmented form of the market. You don't, you have 1.3 billion people, but they're notionally 1.3 billion market. I mean, market of 1.3 billion, but in reality, it's not, right? I mean, you've got one market which is in Mumbai, one market is in Bangalore, one market entirely is this thing, but these markets are not well connected, either because of physical constraint, which is the infrastructure, which I think we can speak about, or to the regulatory concerns. So, we've seen this play out.
Absolutely. And this is where I will now talk about my favorite thing, which is banana chips, right? I just, for a little bit of context, I am a Tamilian who was born and raised in Delhi, right? Which means that a lot of things I was accustomed to eating at home, they were never available in the stores, and you never saw these things around. Like, simple things like banana chips or, South Indian mixture or murukku, or idlis. Idlis, of course, then later became popular in all the Udupi restaurants that sort of, spread all over India. But you didn't get too many South Indian items, right, outside of home, right?
Yeah.
And that has always been a curiosity for me. And then, initially you used to think, acha, people don't know about this. And, maybe North Indian people don't like some of these. It's a taste issue or a preference issue and so on. But I have observed that my friends and everyone I grew up with in Delhi, I mean, you leave a packet of banana chips, it'll just disappear, right? Like any nice packet of chips, right? And I was always curious why you can't get banana chips in Delhi. And herein lies the problem. Right? You have a lot of people making banana chips in Alleppey in Kerala, right? They're typically small firms, right? This is obviously an item that needs to be made fresh, right? Unless you do it at an industrial scale and do nitrogen packing and things like that. It needs to be made relatively fresh, packaged very quickly, and get off the shelves relatively quickly. Now, the trouble is, the good thing is you can sell it in the immediate local areas, right? There's a huge demand for this in Kerala, obviously. Wonderful people with excellent taste, right? Now, for those of us wonderful people with excellent taste in other parts of the country who would really like these banana chips, by the time you get the banana chips from Kerala to, say, Mumbai or Kerala to Delhi, it is incredibly and prohibitively costly. Yeah. And this is what I mean. So now we know that, GST has solved some of these problems. With pre-GST, there used to be variable taxes and therefore tariffs between each state, right? Which means if you had to transport goods from one state to another, they would literally be stopped at the border in a checkpoint. And, trucks used to stand, in these long serpentine lines for hours and days. And you would have to do this for 4 or 5 state borders before you got from Kerala to Delhi. Right? By the time that happens, by the time you've paid the differential taxation, you've paid the bribe money, 10 days worth of sitting in, a truck, which means you need to have better packaging for the banana chips and so on and so forth. It's all doable. It's possible. But then a packet of banana chips is not going to cost 50 rupees. Right? Yeah. It costs 50 rupees in Kerala locally. Now it is going to cost you 200 rupees. Right? Yeah. And the question is, how many people in Delhi who can afford to pay 200 rupees for a packet of banana chips and are willing to pay 200 rupees for a packet of banana chips, right? My mother, my wonderful middle-class mother and grandmother would have said, there is like no way we can make it cheaper at home. We can make it better at home. Right? For most other people who have who don't have that privilege to say we can afford it, but we'll make it at home. For the rest of them, they simply can't afford it. Right? And for everyone else, they may like banana chips, but you have to love it a lot to pay 4 times the amount that you pay for any other kind of viable chips, Lay's or Uncle Chips or whatever you used to get in the store. So this is the reason why not having a unified market, which is, we want a single trading zone. India should be a single trading zone with 0 tariffs and 0 checkpoints and border barriers. Having these barriers really raises the price. And the moment the price goes up, you restrict the market for that particular good, right? Banana chips is one example, but this is true for so many things. I have had better, the Pune chivda that they make, the chitle chivda in New York and in Virginia than I've had in Delhi. Because once again, not enough Maharashtrians in a place, which is dense enough that it's easily available. So if you want to get any South Indian things, very typical banana chips types things, now there are a few more options. But earlier you would have to go to the temple. And, next to the temple, the South Indian temple, there'll be a store which will sell some, South Indian movie DVDs and some Rajnikant movies. It'll also sell, some vegetables which are typically South Indian. It'll also sell, some mixture and potato chips and banana chips and things like that. And it'll be like this tiny little shop, right? That's the way we've been doing this. But I think they should sell this in every supermarket, right? Yeah. That's what I mean by India is not a unified market. So two things need to be done here. One is negative and the other is positive on the part of the government. The negative part is just, simplify GST, right? Make it one simple goods and services tax. Of course, they've removed differentials between states, but even now states are imposing different cesses. So eliminate that and remove all border checkpoints. That's, I think, number one. Number two, we really need to improve our transportation infrastructure. We need to improve trucking. We need to improve warehousing. We need to improve cold storage, right? These are just minimum requirements to ensure that the size of the market is really, really large. If you notice, all our produce, and food consumption tends to be very local supply chains, right? If you want to make it a countrywide supply chain, if you want to make, people in Delhi get elaki banana, right? This is the most delicious thing I've ever eaten and you can't get it anywhere else. To be able to do that, you need very, very good infrastructure and warehousing and transportation. And without it, it can't be done. So both these things need to be done simultaneously, but there is good news. The good news hidden in all of this is not just that someone crazy like me can get her banana chips. The good news is that tiny shop in Alappuzha, Kerala, which was selling, maybe, let's say, 1,000 packets of banana chips a day, has the ability to now sell 10,000 packets of banana chips a day, right? Because they can reach Mizoram, they can reach Delhi, they can reach Bihar, they can reach Kashmir, right? That is what makes this magic, right? So it's not just that my needs will be served. It is that shop, just like the pin factory, is going to grow 10x. Right? It's going to employ more people. It is going to invest more in machinery. It is going to have more people doing sales. Like, this is the extended order. And to extend the order, we need to remove the barriers.
Yeah. So that's, there's a few statistics which obviously stand out on all of these things, right? In terms of the road network in India, you only have, these small roads which are not really meant for the bigger trucks. You only about, I think, 1.7% of total road network in India is in the form of, highways and expressways. The rest are, small rural roads. The other statistic, I think, of course, sometime back before GST came in, but Indian trucks would spend only about 40% of their time moving on the roads. Exactly. The rest of the time they were stationary, right? And what stood out for me was this particular, again, another stat which said that, if I remember correctly, truck carrying goods from, let's say, Gurgaon to Mumbai, and so you can imagine any similar distance would have to pass about 36 checkpoints, and it would take 10 days. Whereas it would be far, you could think of, across the US, it would take, much lesser time, all the way from, Washington on one side to probably New York on the other. It would take, Washington State. To New York, it would take lesser time, right? So,
Absolutely.
These are things that slow up the transportation of goods within India. It complicates the matter to the point that I think a seller will ultimately say, it's not worth it. Let me just not sell that.
It's not worth it. The market is not there. And, the buyer will say it's not worth it. They're not going to pay for it. So it works both ways, right? It ends up, and now just coming to that last tiny point of why can I get better chura and better banana chips in the United States than my mother can get in Delhi when she has closer proximity? The reason is that the South Asian diaspora in the US obviously is a little bit more nostalgic like me for, some of the things we grew up eating, but we also have more purchasing power.
Yeah.
I can pay the 300 rupees equivalent it takes, to do the entire shipping and get the banana chips from Kerala to here, right? I have that. So the market here is big enough because we have the purchasing power, right? And we're all, we all go to the Indian store, which is like this localized place where it sells. Now, the day there are enough South Asians and we are rich enough across the US, it will sell in Walmart. That's the day I'm waiting for. When I can get my Alappuzha banana chips in Walmart and Costco, that will be the magical day of extended order for me. And, one more little thing, this is a curious thing, but I want to mention, there's a wonderful book by Tim Harford. All his books are fantastic, but this one is, it's about the 50 things that made the modern economy. Right. Okay. And one of the things he talks about is standardizing containers, the ship containers.
Right. Yeah,
Standardizing the container meant many things. It meant you could design trucks of a particular size where the standard containers could just go straight from the port onto a truck. They won't have to be repackaged, right?
Yeah.
Now in India, we have other problems because you said we have only about less than 2% of the road network, which is large enough, right? Now, what is going to happen in India? Let's say we do manage to standardize. Let's say we even get our port infrastructure in place and you can, get it straight from the port onto the truck, those big trucks that Volvo used to make. Now, there are two more problems. One, there are many roads which are too small for that truck to pass, right? That's problem number one. Problem number two is there are many places, there used to be a huge discussion in the 90s. I don't know if you remember it, which said we don't have a market for large trucks, like, the kinds you have abroad, the goods trucks, because on our bridges, the culverts aren't strong enough to take the weight of the trucks.
Yeah.
Right? Now, most people don't think about bridges and culverts, right? But to make this a seamless transition, we need to think about the culverts, stress test, not just for me and you to walk across them, but for that goods truck to pass.
Yeah.
And so now you are in a whole different world. So why is there such a long time in India, for goods to go from one point to another? So one, of course, is all your checkpoints that you mentioned, right? But the other is very, very often we are repacking things from one truck to another truck because it's only a smaller truck that can pass the bridge or that can pass this little road or this little gully. So finally, the big trucks will bring it to a particular market or a warehouse, and then a little tempo, right, will take the remaining goods to the last mile, right? So this last mile suddenly becomes extremely costly, right?
Yeah.
We may be able to get it to the outskirts of Delhi, right? But to get it to, one particular suburb of Delhi, like to get it to Ghaziabad or to get it inside Delhi, that last mile suddenly becomes incredibly costly. More so in Mumbai, I'm guessing, because, the roads are much smaller and, it's just an older city, right? By design, it's a differently designed city. So this is something we really do need to think about, how we standardize these processes. And you wouldn't think that the modern economy grew because someone managed to figure out the correct standard for a shipment, a shipment container. But the truth of it is that did the trick, because it suddenly reduced 90% of the wastage that you spend in packing and repacking and all the losses, how all the goods getting damaged, all the delays, all that, by the way, is money, right? That the consumer is not willing to pay for a particular good.
So that's fascinating. And there's so much more we can talk about, but I think we'll move on to the next aspect, which is to do with just the economies of scale. And on that count, let's take a very modern example or what's happening now to talk about this, right? So we have a pandemic going on. There is a need for developing vaccines in the world. So, and we can, there are on this front, there are, I think, multiple examples you can take parallelly, whether it is collecting data for machine learning and AI, or whether it is building a new drug. Economies of scale matter. The size of the market in that sense matters. So you would find that vaccine development is more likely to happen in a big in a country with a large population than in a country with a smaller population. Similarly, for all kinds of new drug development, etc., India's kind of population would make it makes sense to develop new drugs in India, right?
Well, yes and no. So, some of it again has to do with prosperity. Like the American headcount is obviously smaller, but the willingness to pay for, new medication and vaccines is so high that the drug will be manufactured for the United States. Now, of course, India has the advantage of scale in the sense that once a vaccine has been developed, right? So once the Western world, which is rich, is willing to pay money for that particular disease or problem. So, the thing gets invented, right? So once that problem is solved, the cost per dose of vaccine is just going to sharply decrease if you're making hundreds of millions of doses as opposed to, a few thousand doses, right? And there the economies of scale really start mattering. India, as we know, is the cheapest vaccine maker globally, right?
Yeah.
And this is not true for developing new vaccines. It is for replicating on scale existing vaccines, right?
Correct.
And India is able to do it relative to, say, countries in sub-Saharan Africa or, other countries in South Asia, because our market is large enough that we need so many doses of vaccine that there are going to be people who specialize just in very, very large scale vaccines, right? So I'm talking about things like polio, things like smallpox, so, those sorts of vaccines. And now, of course, the next, in line of is what we're all waiting for, which is the COVID vaccine, right? But economies of scale also help on all other margins, right? Now, think about simple things. These vaccines need to be put in a glass container or a glass vial, right? So once again, producing hundreds of millions of that at scale is going to make the cost per unit come down, which means suddenly vaccines get cheaper and more accessible, right? It's true for needles. It's true for the plastic that covers it. It's true across the board for the entire thing to get the vaccine from the lab to the people. Right? So This is something we really need to worry about. Now, I'll mention one more thing. Now, if you notice, the Pfizer vaccine requires cold storage. Right. So people expect that it's not going to show up in India. It's going to be only for the Western world. And some other kind of vaccine will be, developed and actually used in India. Fair enough. Yeah. Now, let's imagine that other option did not exist. Right. Which is not true. But let's just assume it didn't exist. Only the one that required cold storage existed. Right. Developing cold storage infrastructure when the scale is this large is much more value for money than doing it if you're in Bhutan.
Yeah.
Right? Which is a hilly region. Some may say they need less cold storage because it's a small country you can traverse, etc. Some of that is true. But the gains from setting up a cold storage infrastructure in India is going to be so large because the numbers are so big and the scale is so high, right? Now, during the pandemic, we all switched to things online. Right? Like, that was sort of the way we dealt with things. And when I say we, I really mean those of us who were more privileged to be able to work from home and move to things online and so on and so forth. Now, once again, what does it take to have an online network system? Something like having your 4G or 5G network infrastructure. As we know, many of these things need scale because, by definition, to lay the infrastructure or the wires and the pipes for 5G and 4G, it's very, very high fixed cost. Right? But it's very low marginal cost. What I mean by that is once you've set up all the towers and all the wires, then it is very low to connect each additional person onto the network, right? But to set up that initial setup is just very, very costly. So once again, scale helps a lot because normally if we didn't have scale, if it was very low population country, you would see this kind of network in like 3 or 4 big cities. And then the rest of rural India would have just been ignored. Right? In India, the numbers are large enough that you can actually lay these wires and infrastructure, the cellular towers, across the entire country and over a longer period of time recover the money. It will get done in India, right? So once again, during a pandemic, I know people think lots of people, dense areas are a bad thing, but it is the density which also led to the infrastructure that helped us cope with the pandemic, right?
Yeah.
So this infrastructure, the scale, the kind of things you talked about, the economies of scale, they exist only in very large spaces, right? Same with, building mass transit systems, for instance. I know mass transit is now out of vogue in the middle of a pandemic. But one day the pandemic will end and people will have to move around. They will need transportation. And so it makes sense to have metros in very, very large cities, right? In smaller cities, you're better off with a bus service. You're never going to have the numbers that make sense or will recover the cost for a mass transit like a metro. So these are things we do need to think about when it comes to scale. And here it's the rule of large numbers, right? The more number of people, the more likely you are to have a metro. The more number of people, the more likely you are to get 4G quickly, or more likely you are to get your vaccine quickly, right? Your remote areas are not going to get your vaccine first. Your dense big cities are going to get the vaccine first. We already know it because those are the places where people are prosperous. And those are the places where, physical infrastructure will allow the vaccine to show up first.
Yeah. So that, I think, provides a nice segue to the final point, which is on the network goods. So you're talking about high fixed cost, low marginal cost, and this one particular property of these network goods, which is that they're not rivalrous, right? In fact, they're anti-rivalrous, if that makes sense, which is that people actually benefit from more people being on the network. Or if you use that, the larger the network, the greater it is for each person in that network. So this holds true for the infrastructure you spoke about, of course, for telecom and so on. But let's switch our focus to more exciting things, which is happening today. And especially in when people are staying at home under lockdown, which is Netflix and Amazon and so on, all of which are network goods, right? Platform economies that we speak about. So how is it that apart from I have good variety of things that I can watch on TV with Netflix. Apart from that, from an individual perspective, how can India take advantage of its population size when it comes to these network goods?
You've hit the nail on the head. So, the network effect, a network good is a type of good where the good is the network is the good. Yeah. Right? So let's take an example of something like a telephone or email, right? There's no point in just me having a telephone if I have no one to call, right? The more number of people who have telephones, the more likely I will get one because then I can reach them more easily. Same for email, right? You and I are a generation who actually got an email account and had no one to email initially. And then over a period of time, now we have inboxes that we can't manage anymore, right? Yeah. It's true for WhatsApp, right? Or Instagram. The more number of people I know who are on it, the more valuable that good becomes for me. I got on Instagram because I realized there's an entire dog community on Instagram. So both my dogs are now on Instagram. Okay.
Yeah, but the rule of the thumb, Shruti, is that this is true. That is, the larger the network, the better it is, until congestion occurs, which is, when your parents get on Instagram.
Or Facebook as it is, right? Facebook. Absolutely. There's definitely some congestion factor, like, with telephones, it's like all your spam calling, and I'm so exhausted by, Biden and Trump calling me on the phone and telling me to vote for that. So there are some congestion costs, absolutely. But the entire reason for being on the network is the network, right? It's not just the good. Right? So that's the point of a network good. Now, as you can imagine, the larger the network, the more valuable it becomes immediately. So these platform goods, for them, India is a huge market, right? So India is the largest potential number of, new signups and the largest growing market for Facebook in India. This is, of course, true for WhatsApp. This is true for Netflix and Amazon. And for things like Netflix, we are now reaching a point where we have the most number of eyeballs in the world.
Yeah.
Right. In a single, domestic territory. So it's hugely valuable for these people to show up in India, get there first and capture this market. Now, how do you do that? A very interesting thing is happening. Now, when we had the conference for the book, right? Yeah. There was, at that time, I think one Netflix show was an Indian show, which was Sacred Games, was going to launch, right? Yeah. This is a while ago that we had this conference and workshop for the book. Since Sacred Games, like 30 more shows have launched on, Netflix and Amazon. They're all Indian. We have shows on things like the Indian Panchayat Raj system, right? You have shows which are, your classic, Anurag Kashyap derivatives like your Mirzapur and Patal Lok. Everything in India is now a Gangs of Wasseypur derivative, right? So you have those kinds of shows. You have something like Indian Matchmaking, which seems ridiculous and ludicrous, but was like the number one trending show globally on Netflix, right? So you have now suddenly the Indian market is valuable enough that someone needs to cater to them. Right. We've come a very long way from, bad dubbing on Lion King, right, to developing very special content just for India. Now, when we wrote this chapter, that time there was no pandemic and we weren't at war with China. Right. But let me give you an example of how India is got strength in its numbers and the potential market. The first act of retaliation that the Indian government did against China was to ban TikTok. That should tell you something, right? Now, of course, it's a little bit like cutting your nose to spite your face because there were millions of Indian TikTok subscribers who were suddenly left in the lurch without their favorite platform good, right? And they had to switch to other networks. But India's market is so large that if you ban it in India, it can cripple the the company, which is in this case a Chinese company, right? So it's the only way we could find with all our military might of punishing China immediately was to ban TikTok. That should tell you something about, right? It's incredible that that's what happened. Now, I wish I had put that in the chapter, anticipating that, because the point of the chapter was India's place in the new global order, right? Yeah. But there is a huge benefit from this. Another example is cricket. I don't watch much cricket except passively because, at home, all the men are always watching cricket. Right. But just notice what has happened. India has a larger viewing audience than the next 10 cricket viewing and playing nations put together.
Yeah.
Right. So if you look at it, we determine, one tour that India does in New Zealand brings you enough advertising revenue and eyeballs that New Zealand's cricket board is sorted for the rest of the year.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Everyone is desperate for India to show up and play there. All the players abroad are desperate to come and play on our IPL and so on and so forth. And the reason is the number of viewers, the size of the market is just so large that it is very difficult to compete. And it gets you a lot of benefits. Once upon a time, this is in the 80s, moving in 1992, right? This is the year when Pakistan won the World Cup. I am old enough to remember this. Moving the World Cup outside of England was a really big deal. You remember this, right?
Yes.
Saying that it's going to happen in South Asia, of course, all the, colonial powers just threw a shit fit and said, really, it's going to happen. Do you have the infrastructure? Really, you're going to do one in Pakistan, in Lahore. You're going to do one in Eden Gardens. All this drama was going on, right? I remember this quite well. Now, think about what's happening today. It doesn't matter where the World Cup is. It's going to happen at a time when Indians can watch the match.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right? If it's happening in England, I was there for the World Cup last year. And if it's happening in England, it's going to start at 9 a.m. in England, because that's when it's 2 p.m. and it's a, day and night match can actually be viewed in India. Right?
Yeah. T20s in West Indies, and which took place even in Florida in the US. With India versus the West Indies happened in morning, and usually T20s don't,
they don't happen in the morning, right?
But they did because of the Indian audience.
Exactly. So now you are talking about a particular, there is some soft power in this, but there is also some real power in this, in the sense that you and I remember a world when India didn't even have the power to make sure that, the World Cup can easily come to Eden Garden. Right? So that's 100,000 plus stadium, right? Yeah. And people thought, I remember when India lost and didn't make it to the final, everyone thought that Eden Garden will be empty. Right? No one's going to show up. And they just underestimate the kind of cricket viewing nation India is. This is chock-a-block full in a cricket, final World Cup where India is not even playing. So these are aspects, right? Or the size of the numbers, the size of the number of eyeballs which are watching these shows, that determines where things go. So if you notice now, mixed martial arts, NBA, all your soccer franchises, whether it's the German, the EPL, the Spanish, they all are courting the Indian market because that's where the eyeballs and the numbers are. Right?
Yeah, they did that for China for a long time. Right?
They did that with China for a long time.
Yeah.
Exactly. NBA actually found an American Chinese player to kind of be the, ambassador, and, had reality television shows, all sorts of things that they built around to make sure that there is eventually a market and an infrastructure for these things, outside of the United States. So now you will see a lot of these things catering to the Indian audience. Right? A lot of the television already caters to an Indian audience. We've gone from, even post-liberalization, everything that you saw that was in English, right, was necessarily like American Hollywood content.
Yeah.
Right? So it was either British or American content. We were more likely in the 90s and early 2000s to get the American content. So, whether this is Seinfeld or Frasier, Friends, those sorts of shows. Now the English viewing shows are a suitable boy.
Yeah.
Right? And that the only reason that can happen, that's not because suddenly the rest of the world woke up to the book has been around for decades. It's a beautiful book, but now it is economically viable to make it.
Yeah.
Right? You couldn't have made it before with, non-Indian actors. Now it's economically viable to make it because enough Indians will watch it that it'll be a viable TV show. right? Enough Indians speak English. Enough Indians watch Netflix and so on and so forth. I heard a funny story about how everyone was watching Game of Thrones illegally in India. And then they just decided that, HBO should bring the show to India and just allow people to watch it legally. Because apparently that was the largest number of eyeballs for that show, which I was astounded by that. So, these are things that really, change how India is placed vis-a-vis the rest of the world, but more importantly, also how the rest of the world caters to the Indian audience and the Indian consumer, right? It's not just about soft power and hard power. It's also about our everyday lives, right? Are the people I'm watching on television, do they have anything to do with me? Can I relate to them? Can I understand them without dubbing and subtitles? These things are really important, right? As we grow as a nation. And those things happen only because of the rule of large numbers. And this is true for Uber. This is true for, Amazon, Swiggy, Zomato, all your platform goods, right? Platform goods are network goods. Network goods depend on the size of the network. So all of that is now developing in a very, very big way in India.
And leading to, a lot of job creation. I think that's, again, a very concrete benefit that we are seeing from that. Number of people who are employed as delivery agents or in various ways, right? For all of these network goods also have a very real, tangible kind of benefit in form of job creation and employment.
Absolutely. Yeah. Job creation and employment generation. And, I've had a lot of conversations. I take Ubers a lot when I'm in India because, I'm typically going from one lecture to the library to, meeting some friends. I'm sort of always on the road when I'm visiting India. And I always strike up a conversation with the Uber driver because, Uber is so vilified for the way they treat the drivers. And, people are like, oh, they don't pay their minimum wage and so on and so forth. Now, in the Indian context, I've experienced something very different. The Indian drivers will complain a little bit about Uber, but when you ask them why they are on it, they say it gives them greater dignity.
Yeah. But also, it's revealed preference, Shruti.
No, one, of course, is revealed preference. But, it is possible that you are working for a company which is not treating you quite as well. And, there might be things to be fixed in the real world. But having said that, when you ask them why they choose Uber, even with all these problems, they say we don't want to work for someone else because we are treated like help or we are treated like slaves. I mean, we know how the Indian caste system, class system works, right? In the way that, someone who's been working as a driver in your family will forever be treated as a driver. They're barely treated as human, right? They're even called driver. We don't even refer to them by name. Right? The bai is called bai, the aya is called aya, the driver is called driver. It's like such a casteist way of thinking. You are what you do, the profession you were born to do or whatever. We don't even refer to these people by name. Right? And there is a huge difference when you switch to Uber and it says Jagdish has come to pick you up. Right? Let's just start with this person now has a name.
Right. Yeah.
And that visibility that they are in control of their own lives, they're control of their own hours. Aside from job creation, I think that's a very important change that is taking place in India. So everyone is now not your little minion that is working for you. These are people who work so many times. The people who are delivery people have told me that they feel good because they wear a uniform.
Yeah.
Right? So now they're not chotu. They are so-and-so who has come to deliver the Zomato or the Swiggy or whatever, and they come, in a really smart shirt and a cap. And that is very important for their dignity as a human being and dignity of labor, which frankly we don't have in India. So I think there are huge benefits aside from just having, a job. Because there may be some ways to create these jobs alternatively, but we have not afforded a very large population in our country any dignity in their labor.
Yeah. So that's absolutely true, and we've got some way to go even on those terms. But I think this has officially been the longest podcast for all things policy. So we'll bring this to a close. Thank you so much, Shruti, for joining us. And in the chapter, you go into a slightly more detail about how to bring this all together. Right, which is how do you actually take advantage of the large market? How do you make sure that the network goods actually deliver in terms of all the things that we spoke about? How do you unify the market beyond just GST and so on? So labor reforms. How do you actually create a unified market such that we can truly take advantage of India's population? So I'm going to leave that as a dangler.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's the usual standard stuff, labor reform, infrastructure, removing barriers and things like that. But yeah, I would encourage all the listeners to read not just my chapter, but the entire book. It was really like a treat to do this at the workshop in Takshashila. It's just some of the smartest people in a room that I have seen. And it was a joy to be a part of, both the book volume and also the podcast. So thank you so much for having me.
Thanks a lot, Shruti. You're very kind. And thanks everyone for listening in. We'll be back again with another episode. Thank you so much.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Want to wish you all a happy Diwali. Hope you had a great festive season. It's been a great week in terms of the kinds of guests we've had and the kind of conversations we've had on the network this week. Do definitely check some of these things out. On This Round's on Me with Gauri Devidayal, she had a great conversation with Garima Arora, who's one of the best known chefs in the world. It was just absolutely riveting. Do check that out. On States of Anarchy, Hamsini Hariharan spoke about chronicling India's different wars. Again, really interesting episode. Check that out. Ashton had a very interesting episode on his show, The Habit Coach. It was called I Don't Feel Like Doing Anything. It's about how to overcome malaise just generally, and I thought really, really interesting stuff. Kumi Vayana was the guest on Cyrus Says on Monday's episode last week, and she's an educator, and my God, it was such a fascinating conversation talking about the way education functions in India and some of the changes she'd like to see. Just really, really interesting stuff. Do give that a listen. On Uncle Please Sit, Anupam Manur was there with Joel and Tushar talking about the Indian economy, part 1 of a 2-part series. Second part will be out this week. You should definitely check that out. Lastly, I want to talk to you all about the Filter Coffee podcast. Karthik Nagarajan, who hosts that show, is on a little bit of a break. He's back with a banger of an episode. It is with Himura Maya, who used to run Landmark Stores, and they talk about the culture of bookstores and quizzing and all kinds of stuff. Really interesting conversation. Do check that out. And with that, I hope to see you again next week.
Are you constantly seeking happiness? Wondering how to make the most of every day? How not to let your inhibitions stop you from achieving your goals? It's now time to get your A-game on. It's time to unlock your true potential. Tune in to the Empowering series with me, Zarina Poonawalla, to feel empowered in all genres of life. From behavioral skills to management skills. From health to relationships. From mental well-being to emotional well-being. And of course, your finances. I've got you covered. With these tips and tricks from me, Zarina, and true life stories from my amazing guests, you're bound to bring your purest to the table. Tune in to the Empowering series with Zarina Poonawalla every Thursday on the IVM Podcast app, website, or wherever you listen to podcasts.